Good morning. Welcome to Central Baptist Church's first virtual Sunday school class. I'm happy that you joined us. I'm Lee Harlan, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey along with King David through the deserts of Paran and Maon. And we're going to start this morning with the expectation that this is probably going to be the new norm, at least for a few weeks. So I hope you're continuing to be in the Word and study your Sunday school class lesson, because this is a great way to stay close to the Lord during what is obviously some very uncertain times. So let me start by showing you some geography. So if you remember the map of Palestine during the time of King David, we're going to be in this desert right here, just west of the Dead Sea, in the En-Gedi. And that's where the lesson's going to start. Now, since we didn't get a chance to meet last week, you probably didn't have a Sunday school lesson. And so let me just recap a bit. As you recall, King Saul was bent on destroying David. In fact, he used the entire army to chase him into the wilderness, to the point that he left many of the citizens of Israel unprotected. And that allowed the Philistines to raid those cities. And it was only because of a massive raid did he break off his pursuit of David. And that's where we ended in the 23rd chapter. And so the beginning of the 24th chapter, we find David in, as we said, the desert of Maon, in a retreated area called the En-Gedi. It was known as an area of fresh water and fertile ground in the middle of the desert. In fact, it was named the place of the goat springs. So it was a great hiding place for David and his small army. And so after he defeated the Philistines again, Saul pursued David, and he was in that pursuit when his army stopped to rest, and Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. Little did he know that David and his army were hiding in the cave. And so from David's army standpoint, they just knew that God had acted and delivered Saul into the hands of David. So David had a choice to make at that time, to basically kill the person that had been pursuing him, or to do what David had always done in a very principled way, and that was to honor the king that God had installed through Samuel, Saul, even though Saul was bent on David's ultimate destruction. And so rather than kill him, he cut off a corner of his cloak. And then when Saul went back out of the cave, David called to him. Now, Saul didn't recognize him at first. You got to think, David was pretty gruff looking, living in the desert, probably bearded at the time. And as a result of that, he didn't know who this person was that had came out of the cave to speak to David. But he recognized his voice, and he certainly recognized his manner. And so David said to him at the time, why are you chasing me, Saul? I'm but a dog that's already dead. I'm a speck, I'm a flea. So why is the great king of Israel chasing me? For as you know, David had always been a faithful person to Saul and his kingdom. And it was because of that David then made a speech to Saul about how the accusations of rebellion and sedition against the king were obviously false, because he had in his hand the piece of the cloak. He had the ability to kill Saul, and yet he chose not to do it, rather to honor God's choice as Saul as king. And so he did call to attention, though, to Saul that Saul as king had violated the spirit of the Torah by attempting to shed his innocent blood, and he would leave the judgment of that to God, but for him, he would choose to continue to serve Saul. Well, this had an amazing effect on Saul. He, as the scripture said, he was taken aback. In fact, at that point, he actually made the same prediction that Jonathan, his son, had made, that David would be established as the new king. And it would become David's kingdom, not Saul and his descendants' kingdom. He did ask David to promise something, though, to swear an oath. He said, David, when you get to be king, I want you to protect my descendants. I want you to promise me that you'll secure my family's name in the history of Israel. And as we know before, David had also made a similar promise of friendship to Jonathan, and he honored that many years later after both Saul and Jonathan were dead, in that he gave back the lands that Saul possessed to Jonathan's son. And so Saul was moved and returned home, but David, still wary of Saul's unpredictable behavior, went with his men and continued to hide in the desert. And that's where we pick up for this week. So as you look at the 25th chapter of 1 Samuel, you'll see it starts with the death of Samuel. There's not a more critical figure in the Bible that's at the epicenter of transition from the judges to the kingdoms than Samuel. Obviously, Samuel installed Saul as king, and through God's help, chose David to be the next king. And so it was at this time, that at this critical transition, that Saul's work was done on this earth, and God called him home. And so there was a huge funeral to honor Samuel and for the way that he had led, under God's guidance, Israel from judgeships to kingships. This was also a time when there was an opportunity for David's kingdom to start. You know, he's at the very beginning of his kingdom. As you recall, Saul was king for over 40 years. And for the first several years of that kingship, he was faithful to God. He asked God's guidance. But then it became more about Saul day by day and less about the kingship. And so David's at that critical point. He's at the start of what's going to be, what we know to be, the golden age of Israel under the rule of King David. And so it's at that point in time that God presents him, as sometimes he does to all of us, with an opportunity to show what he's made of, whose he belongs to. And so it was at that time that they were in Carmel, and that he came into contact with a man named Nabal and his wife Abigail. Now, it's interesting, there couldn't be two more polar opposites of a couple that was married. Now, Nabal was very rich. In fact, he was so rich that his richness defined him. A greedy man, as the scripture tells us, intent on gain, not on generosity. His was all about intending to keep and certainly not to share. You know, Jesus tells us about folks like this in the New Testament. Remember in Luke, the 12th chapter, where Jesus was asked by two brothers to help divide the inheritance between them. And Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between you? Who appointed me that?" He said, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And remember, he followed it with the parable of the rich man who had an abundant harvest that overflowed his ability to store that harvest. And so the rich man built more and more barns to store the harvest, the surplus grain. And Christ said, "You have plenty of grain laid up for yourself for many years. But what did it profit him? For as we know, that very night he died. So what was left? How did this massive stores profit him? It didn't. Jesus goes on to tell us in Mark, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? And so that's who Nabal was. He was a man intent on himself and his own greed. Now, his wife, Abigail, was a very different personality. She is actually referred to in the scripture in the 25th chapter here as a very beautiful woman, but also a woman of great intellect and wisdom. And so David, being in the desert, decided that he would send a party, as it's recorded in the scripture, to approach Nabal about sharing some of his food with David's men. Now, this was a time in scripture when such things were done. It was sort of the law of the land that if you have a person who comes to you who's in need, that you take from your own wealth and give to them. And so because David had been a shepherd, because he knew what it was like to be in the fields by himself, protecting his sheep from wild animals, he felt it was a reasonable request to ask of Nabal to share some of his food for his men. On the other hand, this was a time of harvest. It was a time of shearing of the sheep. So there was a lot of activity, and so when the men came from David to Nabal and made their request, his response was not what maybe we would have predicted, but it was certainly consistent with who he was. His comments were things like, why should I let you tell me what to do with my food, my possessions? Who are you anyway? Why should I care what you want? Now, from David's standpoint, those were inhospitable words. You see, David's men, while he had been in that area, had protected Nabal and all of his sheep and all of his flocks and all of his personnel from attack by the Philistines. We've just seen that the Philistines would raid from time to time. So this was something that happened routinely. And so David was actually asking him out of what he felt like was a normal request, that Nabal would have gratitude back to David for such a request. But that's not how Nabal responded. He saw it as a request from somebody that didn't mean anything to him. Why would he give his hard-earned life away to someone he barely knew? Isaiah, in the 32nd chapter, speaks of fools. Isaiah says, "For fools speak folly, their hearts are bent on evil. They practice ungodliness and spread error concerning the Lord. The hungry they leave empty, and from the thirsty they withhold water." You see, Isaiah knew what it meant to be a fool. And even Abigail, Nabal's wife, knew that he was a fool. In fact, that's what the word Nabal means in Hebrew, is fool. And so when the men returned and had this, and told David about this affront, that they were chased off, David's response to this rejection was, well, we'd say in East Tennessee, them's fighting words. So he ordered all of his men to strap on their swords, and he strapped on his swords with the intent of going back and basically annihilating Nabal, his family, his flocks, and everything that was there. In fact, he made a statement that that the sun would not set until he had completed this task. You see, this was the beginning of what would be a bloody conflict with no winner. Two male egos going at it, fighting over something that was really of inconsequence. And that's where the Lord intervened. And he came from what might be considered the most lowly place. It came from a servant. Isn't that the way God moves in our lives? Many times that wise wisdom comes from a place that we didn't really expect. And when it comes in a very clear way. And so this came from Nabal's servant who went to Abigail, this nameless servant, as they're not named in the scripture. He wanted to set the record straight. He wanted to tell her what had gone on. And that David was intent, and yet eminently intent, on destroying Nabal, Abigail, and all that they owned. So he sought her intervention because he knew that she was a wise woman. What courage it took for a servant to make that request of his master and of his master's wife. And remember, in this day and time, it took a lot of wisdom, but also a lot of courage for Abigail to then go immediately to David and try to defuse this situation. She was a perceptive woman. She knew her husband's weaknesses. She was not surprised by the fact that he had acted that way. And so she decided that she would go speak with David. And when she did, she told David that her husband was a fool. That basically, if you will, confirmed David's worst assessment of Nabal. But it was at that point that she told David what he would become and how this act of grace, or lack thereof, would define his kingdom from this point forward. She actually, in verse 30, affirmed David as the prince over Israel. And David had a choice to make. Did he act with wisdom under the advice of a wise woman? Or did he act with instinct and fervor and attack to get vengeance? I think we know David made the right call here. And that's a call that all of us are asked to make day in, day out. You know, the Lord is very quick to tell us that indeed when we are affronted, that we should stop and seek his guidance. Think of the situations in your life when you've been wronged, when someone who is your enemy or someone who has treated you poorly, and your immediate response is to react, to seek vengeance, to lash out, to say hasty words, to take a hasty action. David would tell you that because of Abigail, it caused him to stop and pause and try to understand whose he was, whose he belonged to. It was because of her servant and Abigail that David did take pause and did seek God's guidance. And as a result, did not do something that would have basically defined who he was at the very beginning of his kingdom. He chose the Lord. So when the opportunity comes for you to choose, how are you going to choose? Are you going to act out of instinct? Are you going to act quickly? Or are you going to stop? Seek the Lord's guidance. Ask some friends who are wise. And then make your action. You see, in many cases, time is our enemy. We should we should always stop and think. That will serve you well. You know, as I think about my life and who has been maybe the wisest person that has mentored me and been part of me, I think of my father. You know, right now we're fighting an enemy that none of us really understand or even know in a lot of ways how to fight with the coronavirus pandemic. But because of my dad, I know how to act. You see, he grew up in a time when tuberculosis took his two parents at the age of 5. He grew up in a time in the Depression where they had literally nothing. He grew up in a time when the best education he could get was the 5th grade. He grew up in a time when he was old enough and he went to war. It was a global one. He landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day and survived. Later on, he fought in the Battle of the Bulge and survived. He spent 70 days in a French hospital with frostbitten feet and had all his toes to the day he died 10 years ago. Dad knew what it meant to have nothing. Dad knew what it meant to fight in a war. Dad knew what it meant to be kind to others and to stop and think before you acted. He would always say to his son, hey, Jimmy, don't be stupid on purpose. Instead, wait, learn, then act. And if you made a mistake, fess up to it. Don't do it again. Learn from your mistakes. You know, when I think of my dad, I think of this 1881 silver dollar. He carried this in his pocket the entire time he was in World War II. When I was 50, he gave it to me, and I asked him, why did you wait so long to tell me about this coin, Dad? He said, I was waiting until you were old enough to appreciate it. And I certainly did. I think of it every day. In fact, I gave it to my son-in-law when he was deployed to Afghanistan. And it went there and came back. The wisdom that Dad gave to me is just a small amount of the wisdom that God gives to us every day. Seek that. For as the psalmist says, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Folks, the Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob was David's fortress, and he's our fortress today too. I hope you have a blessed day. God bless you for tuning in, and hope to see you next week as we continue to study the Kingdom of David. Thank you.